There's a kind of quietness that settles into a home when everything is no longer as it once seemed. It's like the muffled hum of a washing machine that's too far away to reach. The kind that keeps going even when you feel like you need a break. At 53, I had lived through enough to know that life doesn't always give you clear signs that things are about to change. But sometimes, the small things pile up until one day, you can't ignore the weight any longer. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know where you are listening in the comments. I'd spent most of my adult life thinking of my family as a team working together, supporting each other, doing the best we could to keep things together. I had always done my part. When Emily was younger, I helped her with school fees, bought her textbooks, and gave her what she needed to succeed. She was my only child, and I wanted the best for her. But, as it often goes in life, things don't stay simple forever. The complexity of people and their choices eventually shows up, and you're left dealing with something you never expected. Emily was 27 now, married to Michael, a man she'd met in college. I had always thought of Michael as a decent guy, quiet, reserved, and polite when he was around. Maybe I was wrong. But what father doesn't want to see the best in the people his daughter chooses to surround herself with? It started small. Emily had asked for my help a few years ago, claiming that she wanted to start building her credit. She was newly married, working 2 jobs, and I saw an opportunity to lend a hand. I wasn't naive. I knew what it meant to be financially responsible. I had always managed my finances well, despite the ups and downs of life, and I wanted Emily to have that same security. So, I put her on as an authorized user on one of my credit cards. It seemed like a reasonable thing to do at the time. It's just for a while. I told myself, once she's settled, I'll take her off. I believed this would help her stand on her own. Looking back, I should have trusted my gut. I should have questioned my decisions. But I had been blinded by the love and trust I had for her. Then came the messages, the phone calls, the pictures. At first, they were subtle, but they began to pile up. A new handbag here, a nice restaurant there. I brushed it off. Emily and Michael were doing well. Right, I was proud of her for building a life, but there was something nagging at the back of my mind. A tiny voice I couldn't quite ignore. It wasn't until the trip to Paris that everything became painfully clear. I had received a text from Emily that they were heading to Europe. I was happy for her. Of course, every parent wants to see their children living fulfilling lives, even if it means they can't be part of those experiences. But then, I started seeing the charges. At first, it was a hotel stay, and then it was a boutique in Paris. Next came a few extravagant restaurant meals, all marked with the name of my credit card on them. The moments I had spent pouring into their lives, paying for their wedding, helping with the house, being the constant father they turned to for support felt like they were slipping away like sand through my fingers. Emily, my daughter, was using my money without a second thought. They were on vacation while I sat at home. My life reduced to the quiet hum of a home that had once been full of activity, laughter, and connection. But now, it felt hollow. The irony, I suppose, was the most painful part. Emily had always been so independent, always assuring me that she would be fine, that she didn't need my help anymore. But now, it seemed like my financial support was expected, like it was a given. They had excluded me from their lives when it suited them. But my money, that was always welcome. As the days went by, the charges kept piling up. Boutique chic in Paris, Over $1,000 spent on things I didn't even understand. I began scrolling through the transactions, each new one, a reminder of the betrayal I had been too blind to see. Emily and Michael were living the life they wanted, with no regard for the sacrifices I had made for them. I sat in my office one night, staring at the screen. The only sound was the tap of my fingers on the desk as I processed what I was seeing. It wasn't anger that started to build inside me first, it was something else. Something colder. The realization that I had been manipulated for so long took root. I had given, expecting nothing in return, except simple gratitude. But I had been taken advantage of. I had been part of a system I didn't understand. This wasn't family support. This was exploitation. I stood up and walked around my office, my mind spinning. There was a knot in my stomach, but also a strange sense of clarity starting to form. I could feel it the moment when things shifted, when the balance tipped in my mind. I had always been there for Emily, but now it was time for me to take control. For the first time in a long while, I was the one making decisions for my own life. I opened the app on my phone, navigating to the authorized users section, where Emily's name sat, taking up space on my credit card. The numbers on the screen, the bright digital text, felt like they were taunting me. There it was, the confirmation I had been avoiding, the choice to finally sever the connection that had allowed her to take my resources, my time, and my money without ever giving anything back. I hovered my finger over the remove user button. I thought about all the times I had given, all the times I had let Emily take what she needed. But what had I received in return? A growing sense of manipulation, of betrayal, of being a tool in their lives. A brief flash of hesitation crossed my mind, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared. And then I pressed the button. "Are you sure this action cannot be undone?" the message asked. "Yes," I responded. "Remove immediately." It was done. Emily no longer had access to my account. I stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of it all. A small smile began to form on my face, something that had been absent for weeks, maybe months. For the first time in ages, I felt something other than the suffocating sense of duty I had carried for so long. I had taken control. It was a strange feeling, one that was both foreign and satisfying. I set the phone down on my desk with deliberate care, my reflection staring back at me from the darkened screen. There it was, an older man with a lifetime of experiences behind him. A man who had finally decided to stop being the passive player in his own life. I walked to the kitchen, moving with purpose. As I made my coffee, the ordinary sounds of the world outside my window crept in, neighbors starting their day, the hum of life going on as usual. And yet, in my heart, I knew something had changed. It wasn't much, but it was something. For the first time in days, I felt something like peace. The air was crisp that morning, the kind of cool that made the scent of fresh coffee taste sharper, like it could wake up every inch of your body. For the first time in weeks, I found myself enjoying the simple act of drinking coffee, sitting in my kitchen, the morning light pouring through the window. The world outside was still waking up, and I, too, felt like I was beginning to wake up from a long, unspoken slumber of silence and suppression. I had just finished my first cup when the phone rang. The number on the screen was one I recognized, a number from overseas. My pulse skipped a beat, and my stomach clenched. I knew exactly who it was. It had been a while since I'd heard from Emily, but I could tell by the intensity of the phone's buzzing that this wouldn't be a simple check-in. I watched it ring for a moment longer than I should have. The warm glow of the kitchen, the stillness of my day, suddenly felt at odds with the agitation building in my chest. I knew that I could ignore it. I knew that I could let it go straight to voicemail. But something in me didn't want to. Something inside me was still that same father who couldn't fully cut the tether. Even when everything inside me told me I should, the ringing stopped, and I let out a slow breath, my hand hovering over the phone before I finally picked it up. "Good morning to you too. Lindsay," I said calmly, my voice steady. But there was something new in it, something I didn't quite recognize. It wasn't the nervous, appeasing tone I used to have when I answered her calls. This time, I wasn't rushing to please her. On the other end, I could hear her sharp intake of breath. She had expected a different response. I'm sure an apology. Perhaps, or a frantic attempt to fix whatever mistake I had made in her eyes. "Dad, what did you do to the card?" she demanded, her voice tight with impatience. But there was no mistaking the tone laced with anger, entitlement, and disbelief. It wasn't a conversation starter. It was an accusation. I could hear her shuffling around on the other end. The background noise of her life in Paris. The sounds of a bustling street. The faint hum of an ongoing vacation, one that I had unknowingly funded. "I removed your access to my account," I said, the words coming out almost too easily. Maybe it was the coffee. Or maybe it was the sense of calm that had settled in my chest after clicking that remove button. Whatever it was, I felt different, like I was finally standing on solid ground again. "Don't give me that," she snapped, her voice cutting through the line, demanding to be heard, as though I were the one who had crossed some invisible line. I tried to pay for lunch, and it was declined in front of Todd's parents. The waiter had to come back 3 times. It was humiliating. Her words hung in the air for a moment, and I let them. I let the silence speak for itself. She had told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't worried about my well-being, or even about me at all. She was worried about the inconvenience to herself, the humiliation of having her card declined. It was telling, wasn't it? She never once stopped to ask how I was doing, or if I was okay. "That must have been embarrassing," I replied, leaning back in my chair, taking another sip of my coffee. There was no anger in my voice, just the slightest trace of something I didn't expect: indifference. It was strange. This feeling of distance I was beginning to feel from her. All these years of her calling, asking, demanding, and I had always responded. But today, I felt a distance that I couldn't ignore. Embarrassing, it was mortifying, she continued, her voice rising in pitch. "You can't do that." "Dad, I need that card." "For what?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "I thought you didn't need me taking care of you constantly." There was a beat of silence on the other end before she responded, her voice dripping with frustration and disbelief. "That's completely different. You just can't cut me off like that. I'm your daughter." I could hear the familiar tone creeping back, and the one that always used to make me feel guilty. The one that used to pull at my heartstrings. It was that voice she had always used when she wanted something, when she needed something. And it always worked. It always made me bend. But not this time. This time, I could feel it. I wasn't bending anymore. The silence between us felt long, unbearable even. Her voice finally broke through. "Despérate," with the sharp edges of a threat. "If you don't restore my access right now, there will be consequences." "Consequences," I repeated, leaning forward, now more intrigued by the way she was escalating things. "What kind of consequences?" A muffled conversation reached my ears. And then, almost as if she had gathered herself, she came back at me with the venom I knew all too well. "Todd and I have been talking. When we get back, We're looking into care facilities. You obviously can't handle your finances responsibly. We'll sell your house to pay for it. You don't need all that space anyway. The words hit me like a slap, and for a moment, I couldn't breathe. They weren't just insults, they were an ultimatum. A plan to strip me of my independence, of my dignity, to take away my home, my sanctuary, and lock me away somewhere that suited their needs. Not mine. The audacity was staggering. Dad, are you listening? She asked, her voice cracking with the tension of the situation. I let the silence linger for a moment longer before responding. I heard every word. Good. So? You'll fix it, she demanded, a sense of finality in her voice. I could feel my heart beat steadily in my chest. I set my coffee cup down on the table, the action deliberate, careful. It felt like the most definitive thing I had done in days. No, I said simply. Her voice escalated, almost shrill. What do you mean? No, I mean no, I repeated. Enjoy the rest of your family vacation. Dad, don't you dare. I hung up. My finger moved with a purpose, pressing the end call button without hesitation. The buzzing stopped, the silence in the room growing deeper, more profound. I let the phone rest on the table as I looked out the window. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel the weight of obligation pressing down on me. It was as if something had lifted, a burden I hadn't realized I had been carrying for so long. I wasn't a victim anymore. Not today. I stood up slowly, moving to the window and looking out at the street. My house, the place I had built and maintained for over 30 years, stood there quietly, a symbol of my life, my choices, and my hard work. I hadn't realized how much of my sense of self had been tied to it, how much of my identity had been tied to Emily and Michael, to the life I thought I was supporting. But now, I knew this house was mine. It always had been, and that was when the second realization hit me. The one I had been avoiding for so long. They thought they could sell my home. They thought they could strip me of everything I had worked for because they believed I was too weak, too dependent, too foolish to take control. But I wasn't foolish. Not anymore. I walked into my office. The click of my boots against the hardwood floor, now steady, purposeful. He set a me disc, pulled open the filing cabinet, and retrieved the deed to my house. I spread it out across the table, my finger tracing the signature. The name on the deed was mine, and it always had been. I didn't need them to take care of me. Not now. Not ever again. And for the first time in years, I felt free. The phone call had ended with a finality I hadn't expected. As the line went dead, I sat back in my chair, feeling a strange sense of calm settle over me. The air in the room seemed to shift, and for the first time in months, I wasn't consumed by the rush of guilt and anger that always followed my interactions with Emily. Instead, there was a quiet clarity, a sense of relief that I hadn't expected. Maybe it was the fact that I had finally drawn a boundary one I hadn't been able to before. Or maybe it was just the simple fact that, for once, I had done something for myself. I took a slow breath, my eyes still staring at the phone on the table. The phone had become a symbol of everything I had let myself become dependent on: their calls, their demands, their needs. But now, it was different. It was just a phone, and I was free to choose when I answered it. I was free to decide when I would give. And for the first time in a long time, I realized something I didn't have to give anymore. I stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the quiet street outside. My house was still there, a solid presence on the block, just as it had been for years. But now, it felt like Mina again. Not because it was just a structure, but because it was my history, my effort, my identity. It was the one thing in my life that had remained truly mine, untouched by the demands of others. I had built it, maintained it, and lived in it, not as a caretaker for someone else, but as a man who had earned every inch of it. As I looked out, I began to realize that my relationship with Emily had always been shaped by a need to prove something to her, to myself, and to the world. I had spent so much of my life trying to be the provider, the protector, the one who was always there. But in the process, I had lost sight of who I was. I had let her and Michael dictate what I should do, how I should behave, and even how I should feel. It was as if I had been living someone else's life, constantly bending and adjusting to fit into a role they had assigned me. But now that role no longer fit. I walked back to my desk and looked at the deed again. My finger traced the lines, the familiar signature on the bottom. It was a piece of paper. Yes, but it was also a symbol of my autonomy, of my ability to make decisions that were right for me. This house, my house, was mine to keep or sell, to care for or leave behind. It was mine, and I could do with it whatever I pleased. A small smile tugged at the corner of my lips. I had let Emily and Michael believe they could control me. I believed they could push me into corners I didn't want to be in. But I wasn't their pawn anymore. I had broken free. I didn't need them to validate my choices, to tell me I was doing the right thing. I knew now that I was... The thought was liberating. I stood up again, the smile still lingering as I walked out of my office and into the kitchen. The coffee maker, still warm from my earlier cup, hummed softly. I poured myself another, the heat of the mug in my hands grounding me in the present moment. The world outside the window hadn't changed. My neighbor's dog was barking in the yard across the street. The leaves rustled in the trees. Life, it seemed, was continuing as it always had. But for me, everything was different now. I had taken control. I had made the decision to step away from a toxic cycle, to stop being the father who always said yes, the father who always gave in, the father who believed that love meant sacrificing everything for others. No, I wasn't going to do that anymore. I picked up my phone, the same phone I had just put down moments ago, and opened the contacts. I didn't want to waste time on the call, but there was something I had to do. I found Marcus's number in my list, Marcus Chen, the real estate agent I had worked with when I bought both properties. He was trustworthy, discreet, and efficient. I had always admired that about him. I dialed his number, and it rang 3 times before he picked up. Caleb. How's it going? Marcus's voice was warm, friendly. It always had been. But today, it felt different. I wasn't the same Caleb he had worked with before. Marcus, I need to sell the Maple Street property. I want it done quickly. Can you handle that for me? There was a brief pause on the other end. I could hear him tapping at his keyboard, probably pulling up the details of the property. Sure, Caleb. I can get that started right away. The market's still strong. You'll get a good price for it. I want it sold fast. I insisted. Price it to move. I hear you, Marcus replied, his tone serious now. I can have a team in there tomorrow. We'll list it right away. Get photos and handle the paperwork. How quickly are we talking? Immediately, I said. The word firm and resolute. I need it gone. Got it, he said. No further questions asked. I'll take care of everything. Caleb, I'll get the paperwork ready and have the team there by tomorrow morning. I hung up the phone, feeling a sense of satisfaction that surprised me. The deal was already in motion. The wheels were turning, and things were happening, just as I had planned. The sale of the property would be swift. There was no time to waste. As I began to make arrangements for the move, I thought about the next step, how I would handle the logistics of everything. I needed to make sure that Emily and Michael's things were packed up and put away. They had left behind so much. Their home had been full of possessions, of items that didn't belong to them, and I was about to reclaim that space. I made a few more calls, this time to a moving company. I needed them to handle the furniture, the clothing, and the mementos they had left behind. It was strange, this feeling of detachment. I had always associated those things with Emily, with her life, her needs. But now, they felt foreign to me. They weren't her things anymore. They were just objects that could be moved, stored, or sold. I found a local moving company with good reviews, Dave's Honest Moving. The name alone gave me the confidence I needed. I dialed the number, and within minutes, I had arranged for the movers to come the next day. Dave, the owner of the company, picked up on the first ring. Dave's Moving. How can I help? I need to move some belongings from a house on Maple Street, I said, my tone businesslike, but with the undercurrent of satisfaction that I could feel inside. It's a time-sensitive situation. Can you be there tomorrow morning? Sure thing, Dave said, without missing a beat. We can have a truck and 2 guys there first thing. You need it all packed up. Yes. Everything needs to go into storage, I replied. The residents aren't around, but I need everything out before they come back. Understood, Dave said, his voice steady, professional. We'll get it done for you. Do you have a storage unit set up? Not yet, but I'll arrange it. Can you recommend somewhere? Secure Storage on Brady Street. I work with them all the time. I'll give you their number. They'll take care of you. I thanked him and quickly arranged for the storage. The next morning, the movers arrived, and I met them at the property, my hands steady and firm as I handed over the keys to the house. It felt oddly empowering to be in control of this situation. The movers worked quickly and efficiently, loading up everything, from the high-end furniture to the personal items that seemed to belong to another life, another version of Emily and Michael's life. I watched them work, feeling a strange sense of closure. The house was emptying out, but instead of feeling sadness or regret, I felt relief. I wasn't just clearing out a house. I was clearing out years of emotional baggage, years of manipulation and entitlement. It wasn't just about the property. It was about reclaiming myself. By the time they finished, it was late morning. I locked up the house, pocketing the keys. I didn't look back as I walked to my car. There was nothing left for me there. I had taken the first step toward taking my life back. I pulled into the storage unit later that afternoon and watched as the last of their belongings disappeared behind the doors. It was over. The moving truck had long since driven away, and the house on Maple Street stood silent behind me. I sat in my car for a moment, the engine still running, my hands gripping the wheel with a purpose I hadn't felt in years. There was something oddly satisfying about seeing that space emptied, about knowing that all the material things that once defined Emily and Michael's life were now reduced to just items in a storage unit. It wasn't just their belongings that had been packed away. Something in me had been packed away too, hidden deep inside, locked away where I didn't have to acknowledge it. But now, it was time for the next step. I didn't know what it would look like, but I knew it had to come. As I pulled into my driveway back home, I felt a familiar stirring in my chest, a mix of anticipation and something else, something I couldn't quite place. I had done everything I could to untangle myself from the web I had been caught in, but I could already sense the storm on the horizon. I knew Emily and Michael wouldn't take this lying down. They would fight back. They would come for me. They would try to make me feel guilty. But I was ready for them now. The house felt different as I stepped inside. The same creaking floorboards, the same familiar smell of old wood and polished furniture. But there was a shift. The weight of obligation that had hung over me for so long seemed lighter, as if a heavy curtain had been pulled back, revealing something else. Clarity. I sat down at the kitchen table and poured myself another cup of coffee, my fingers still trembling slightly as I held the warm mug. I wasn't nervous. I was something else. Stronger, more grounded. I was finally facing the consequences of my choices, not in fear or regret, but with a sense of control I hadn't known I was capable of. The phone buzzed again, pulling me from my thoughts. I glanced at the screen. A number from Paris. Emily. I exhaled slowly. I knew this moment would come. They were going to try to reach me. She was going to try to get me to reverse my decision. I wasn't surprised, but I wasn't going to cave either. I answered the phone. Dad? Emily's voice was frantic, almost breathless, as if she had been running on pure emotion since I had cut her off. What is going on? Where is everything? Why did you do this? I let the silence stretch for a few beats. I could hear the background noise, the murmur of voices, the sound of glasses clinking, faint music playing. She was still on vacation, still living her life, while I was left to deal with the mess she had created. Emily, I said calmly, my voice steady, despite the fire she was throwing my way. I did what I had to do. I'm not going to apologize for that. She laughed bitterly, a harsh sound that grated against the phone. You don't get it, do you? She spat. You don't understand what you've done. You've ruined everything. We trusted you. And now you've completely turned your back on us. Have I asked? My voice colder than I had intended. Or have you just become so used to me bending over backward for you that you don't even recognize when it's time for me to stand up for myself? There was a moment of stunned silence on the other end. I could almost see her face contorting in disbelief. I wasn't the same man I had been when she left for Paris. This version of me was someone who had finally stopped playing the role of the submissive father, the one who let his children walk all over him. You can't do this, she said, her voice rising again. This house, these things, they were mine. You took them from me. How could you? I let her words wash over me. Unbothered. You never asked for them. You never earned them. You never appreciated them. The words were coming out before I could stop them. But they were true. Emily had always taken from me, always expected me to give, and I had done it without question. Until now. You and Michael wanted everything handed to you without lifting a finger. And when I stopped, you retaliated. I heard her take a sharp breath, and then her tone shifted. Less accusatory and more manipulative. Dad, you don't understand. I need that house. I need the money. Michael and I, we can't afford to live without it. You can't just leave us stranded like this. You're not stranded. Emily, I replied, my voice firm. You've always had the means to stand on your own, but you've always preferred to lean on me, expecting me to carry your weight. That's not my responsibility anymore. I could feel her anger boiling over, the frustration palpable through the phone. How could you do this to your own daughter? She wailed, her voice cracking with false tears. After everything I've done for you, after everything you've promised me, how could you take that from me? It was then that I realized the emotional manipulation had always been there. I had been blind to it for so long. But now, it was clear. Every word, every tone, every accusation, it was all designed to make me feel guilty, to make me doubt my own decisions. But I wasn't going to let her do that anymore. You've done nothing for me, Emily, I said, the words sharper than I intended. You've always used me, and I've let you think that it was okay to take, and never give anything back. But I'm done. I'm done being the one who has to clean up your messes. I'm done carrying you and Michael. She was silent for a moment, and for the first time in the conversation, I could hear the faintest tremor in her voice. So, you're just going to leave us out here, without anything? I wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything I had done to get to this point. You'll figure it out. You've always figured it out, Emily, but you won't be using me anymore. Her voice faltered again, this time with a hint of desperation. Dad, please. You're being unreasonable. Please. Just give me the house. It's all I've ever wanted. I stood up, pacing the room as I spoke. You've never wanted the house. You've wanted control. You've wanted me to be your safety net, and I've allowed it. But that's not my job anymore. There was a long pause, and then I heard it, the sound that I knew would come eventually. The sound of her giving up, of realizing that this time her tactics weren't working. She was no longer in control of the conversation. She wasn't in control of me anymore. Fine, she whispered, her voice a low, defeated murmur. I'll deal with it. The words felt final. For the first time, I could hear the weight of reality settling in on her. This wasn't going to be the same. She couldn't manipulate me into giving in. I leaned back against the kitchen counter, my hand still clutching the phone. I'm glad you finally understand. There was another silence, but it was different this time. It wasn't the silence of someone trying to manipulate or guilt-trip me. It was the silence of someone who had finally realized they couldn't get what they wanted. Goodbye, Emily, I said quietly. Before ending the call, I sat back in my chair, my body heavy with the realization of what I had just done. I had just severed the last of the ties that had bound me to a life of constant compromise and subjugation. I had let go of the role I had been playing for so long, and in doing so, I had found a piece of myself I thought I had lost forever. The phone sat quietly on the table now, no longer a symbol of guilt, manipulation, or responsibility. It was just a phone, just a tool, and I was no longer the man who answered it every time it rang. I walked to the window again, looking out at the street, my thoughts clearer than they had ever been. The world outside was still the same, but I was different. I had taken control of my life, and for the first time in years, I felt at peace. The silence after the call lingered longer than I expected. The house was quiet around me. The hum of the refrigerator, the only sound in the kitchen. I sat at the table, staring at my coffee cup, feeling the weight of what had just happened. Emily's voice, her desperation, the threats, it all floated in my mind like a thick fog I had finally pushed through. For so many years, I had let her dictate the rules, let her manipulate my sense of duty, my feelings of obligation. But now, the fog was clearing, and for the first time in decades, I could see myself clearly. I leaned back in my chair and closed my eyes for a moment, letting the stillness seep in. My breathing slowed, and I felt a pulse of energy I hadn't known in years. There it was, the clarity I had been chasing, buried beneath years of overgiving and emotional manipulation. I wasn't powerless anymore. I wasn't just a father responding to the whims of his child. I was a man reclaiming his life. And it was exhilarating. The first step was obvious. I had to secure my assets. The things that had long been the source of tension and exploitation. That meant not only removing Emily from my credit accounts, which I had done, but also taking action on the properties I had purchased for her and Michael. They had assumed ownership of the Maple Street house for far too long without ever completing the paperwork. They had lived in it, used it, and treated it as if it were theirs, while I quietly maintained everything. Now, it was time for me to remind them and myself that I was the one in control. I opened my laptop and pulled up the deeds for both properties. The Maple Street home had always been in my name. Just as I had suspected, every signature, every line of legal text confirmed my ownership. I traced the lines with my finger, feeling a sense of satisfaction I hadn't felt in years. It was mine, legally and rightfully. And for the first time, it felt as if the law itself was on my side. I called Marcus Chen, the real estate agent I trusted more than anyone, and explained the situation. He listened patiently, his calm, measured tone grounding me, even as my emotions surged. "Caleb," he said, "we can list the property quickly. The market is hot, and buyers are motivated. We can have showings starting tomorrow if needed." I felt a thrill at his words. For so long, I had been reactive, caught in the emotional currents Emily and Michael had stirred. Now, I was proactive. I was making decisions, setting plans into motion, and watching them unfold exactly as I intended. It was intoxicating. The next morning, I arrived at the Maple Street property early. The neighborhood was waking up, the autumn sun reflecting off the dew on the lawns. Dave's honest moving truck was already there, engine humming. Two men unloading equipment with efficient precision. Dave himself greeted me with a firm handshake, his presence a reminder of the professional support I had marshaled. "Mr. Owens," he said, "we're ready to start whenever you are." I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The house smelled of familiar life. Emily and Michael's belongings were everywhere, a testament to years of comfort, neglect, and assumption. The furniture, the electronics, the wardrobes, it was all mine to command. And command I would. We began systematically, room by room. Boxes were labeled, wrapped, and loaded with meticulous care. I insisted on helping, moving heavier items with my own hands, reminding myself with each lift that I was reclaiming, not just objects, but years of energy and authority that had been siphoned from me. In the living room, the leather sofa, a wedding gift from me, went into a box. In the bedrooms, electronics and personal effects followed, each item a symbol of what had been taken for granted. As the movers worked, I found myself reflecting. There had been a time when Emily was a small child, dependent and loving. Back then, guiding her, supporting her, giving her what she needed, felt natural. But somewhere along the way, dependency had mutated into entitlement. The love I had given freely had been twisted into a mechanism for control, and I had let it happen, over and over, without resistance. But that was over now. By late morning, the house was empty. Dave's team secured the last of the items in the truck and prepared to deliver them to the storage unit I had arranged. I followed them, feeling a growing lightness with each mile. This was my life again, unfolding on my terms, free from the expectations and manipulations that had held me captive for so long. At the storage facility, we unloaded everything into Unit 47B. As I watched the last of Emily and Michael's possessions disappear behind the heavy metal doors, I felt a strange mixture of emotions: relief, vindication, and even a little melancholy. There was a nostalgia there, for the life I had envisioned for them, for the years I had spent hoping that love and support would be reciprocated. But nostalgia was a luxury I could no longer afford. What mattered now was reality, and reality had shifted decisively in my favor. Driving home afterward, the streets of Toronto passed by in a blur, the maple leaves, golden and orange in the early fall sun, seemed to mirror the turning point in my life. I had spent decades anchored by duty, obligation, and emotional manipulation, but now I was untethered. I had agency, I had autonomy, and for the first time in years, I could envision a future entirely of my own making. I arrived home and parked in the driveway. The house, quiet and still, seemed to greet me with a new sense of respect. I walked inside and let myself breathe fully, deeply, as if inhaling freedom itself. Every corner of the home, every familiar sound, every lingering scent of coffee and wood was now a reminder not of sacrifice, but of independence. Sitting in the living room, I let my thoughts drift. What would I do now that I was truly free? I considered travel, new experiences, hobbies long neglected. I thought about the small joys that had once been eclipsed by responsibility and manipulation. I imagined mornings without anxiety, afternoons without the constant pull of someone else's demands. I allowed myself a small smile. This was mine. This moment, this life, it belonged to me. I realized that freedom, true freedom, didn't come from rebellion alone. It came from careful, délibérée décision, from taking control when others assumed they held the power. I had done more than just reclaim a house or remove a credit card. I had reclaimed my life. That evening, I sat in the kitchen with another cup of coffee, looking out the window at my yard. The quiet world outside mirrored the calm in my chest. I felt the weight of years lifting, the tension of constant expectation releasing. For the first time in a very long while, I felt present, alive, and fully in control. The phone remained on the counter, silent, dormant. It no longer represented obligation or manipulation. It was simply a tool, one that I now controlled completely. And for the first time in decades, I felt ready to live my life on my own terms. Unafraid, unburdened, and wholly free. I took a final sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through me, grounding me. The world outside carried on, unaware of the battles I had fought and won. And I didn't mind, because inside, in my quiet home in Toronto, I had won something far more important than material possessions or legal victories. I had won myself. I stood up and walked through the house, each step deliberate, each movement a reminder of the power I now possessed. The past could not control me anymore. Emily and Michael could not dictate my life. And as I looked out the window at the setting sun, painting the city in shades of gold and crimson, I finally understood the depth of what I had achieved. I had taken control. I had claimed autonomy. And in that act, I had found a peace I hadn't known existed. This was the life I would live from now on, one choice at a time, fully aware, fully present, and entirely my own. No longer a father trapped by the expectations of a manipulative child. No longer a man bending to the will of others. For the first time, I was simply Caleb, my own person, free and unbound. The sun had set on a quiet evening in Toronto, the colors of the sky shifting from soft oranges to the deep purples of night. I sat in my living room, a glass of whiskey in hand, my eyes following the shadows of the trees outside as they stretched long across the lawn. The house was peaceful, too peaceful. Perhaps it was a calm I hadn't known in years. The kind of stillness that settles in after a storm has passed, leaving only the remnants of what was once chaotic. But I knew the storm wasn't truly over. I had made my decision. I had taken control. But the consequences of my actions were only just beginning to unfold. The phone sat on the counter, unused, a reminder of the battle I had fought and won, at least for the moment. It was strange how one small action, a single decision, could change everything. I had severed ties with Emily and Michael, but I had also severed something deeper within myself. No longer was I the man who put everyone else's needs before my own. No longer was I the one who would bend, sacrifice, and carry the weight of others' mistakes. I was free. And yet, the weight of what I had done, the finality of my actions lingered in the air. I thought about the phone call with Emily earlier that morning, the desperation in her voice, the way she had tried to manipulate me one last time, only to find that it didn't work. The words still echoed in my mind. How could you do this to your own daughter? And then my response. How could you do what you did to your own father? It was a question that had been buried deep inside me for years, waiting to be asked. And now that it was out in the open, there was no going back. Emily wasn't just upset about losing the house or the material possessions. She was upset because, for the first time in her life, I had stopped being her enabler. I had stopped being her source of unlimited support. And she didn't know how to handle that. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. She and Michael had used my money, my resources, and my emotional support without ever giving anything back. They had been playing a game, and I had unknowingly been their pawn. But I had broken free. I had taken back control of my life, and in doing so, I had dismantled their carefully constructed world. I didn't know exactly how they would respond. I had a sinking feeling that they would escalate their tactics, maybe even take legal action, but I wasn't afraid anymore. I had been afraid for too long, afraid of losing my daughter, afraid of disappointing my family, afraid of being seen as a failure. But now, for the first time, I wasn't afraid to stand on my own 2 feet, to live life on my own terms. The first sign of trouble came a few days later. The phone rang early in the morning, an international number flashing across the screen. I knew who it was before I even picked it up. Emily. I hesitated for a moment, but then I answered, my voice calm, controlled. Dad. Emily's voice was tight, strained. We need to talk. I didn't reply immediately. Just let the silence stretch. My hand hovered over the phone. But I wasn't ready to speak just yet. I wasn't sure if I wanted to hear what she had to say. I wasn't sure if I cared anymore. Dad, are you there? She asked, her voice snapping me out of my thoughts. I'm here, I replied, leaning back in my chair. What do you need? Emily, I need you to fix this, she said. Her words clipped. You've made a huge mistake. You can't just take everything from us. I need the house. I need it back. Michael and I, we can't afford to keep living like this. You can't just leave us out in the cold. I could hear the desperation in her voice. But I didn't flinch. I had heard this tone before. It was the same tone she had used when she wanted something, when she needed something. And I had always given in, but not anymore. Emily, I said, my voice steady. The house isn't yours. It was never yours. It was always mine. And I decided to sell it. You don't get to make demands anymore. You don't get to manipulate me into giving you what you want. That chapter is over. There was a long pause on the other end. and I could almost hear the wheels turning in her head as she processed what I had just said. I had never spoken to her like this before. I had never drawn a line in the sand, but I wasn't about to back down now. "Dad, please," she pleaded, her voice softer now. "You don't understand. We need the money. We can't keep up with the bills without it. I don't know where else to turn." I could feel my frustration building, but I kept it in check. "You need to figure it out. Emily, I'm not your safety net anymore. You're grown. You have a husband. You have your own life. It's time to take responsibility for it." Her voice wavered again, and for a split second, I thought I heard a tremor of fear in her tone. But then, as if a switch had flipped, her voice became cold. "You'll regret this. You'll regret cutting us out like this. We'll take you to court. We'll fight you for everything. Do what you have to do," I replied, my voice firm, unwavering. "But it won't change anything. The house is gone. It's over." With that, I hung up. The finality of it hit me then, like a weight lifting from my chest. I wasn't the man who had always been there to clean up their messes. I wasn't the man who would bend to their will anymore. I was Caleb, a man who had taken control of his life, and I would not let them drag me back into their toxic, manipulative games. The days that followed were a blur of paperwork, phone calls with my lawyer, and emails with Marcus Chen, the real estate agent who had already begun marketing the property. It was a fast process, faster than I had expected, but I didn't mind. I was ready for it. I was ready for whatever came next. A week later, the unexpected happened. The house had sold for $185. 000. Far more than I had hoped for. It was a cash offer. From a young couple who had recently moved to Toronto. They were eager to settle in, and I was eager to move on. I signed the paperwork and received the transfer confirmation. My heart steady as I read the figures on the screen. It was done, but that wasn't the end of it. A few days later, I received a letter from Emily's lawyer, a formal document outlining her intention to take legal action. She was suing me for what she claimed was her inheritance. She accused me of wrongful sale and theft, claiming that the house had always been meant for her and that I had no right to sell it without her consent. I wasn't surprised. I had known it was coming, but I wasn't afraid either. I had legal counsel, and I had the law on my side. The property was mine, and I had every right to do with it as I saw fit. The lawsuit dragged on for weeks, but it never amounted to anything. Emily's claims were dismissed by the court, and she was ordered to pay her own legal fees. The whole thing was a waste of time, a desperate attempt to regain control that would never work. In the end, Emily and Michael lost. I didn't gain anything from the court case, but I didn't need to. I had already gained my freedom. I had already taken back control of my life. As I sat in my living room one night, reflecting on everything that had happened, I realized that I had made the right choice. I had stood up for myself when it mattered. I had reclaimed my autonomy, my space, my peace. The house was gone, but what I had gained was worth more than any material possession. The phone sat quietly on the table now, unused, and I felt no desire to pick it up. I didn't need it. I didn't need to be constantly reminded of the life I had left behind. What mattered now was the life I was building for myself. And for the first time in years, I felt a profound sense of relief. The battle had been won, and I was finally free. The days that followed the court case felt strangely anticlimactic, almost as if the weight of the battle had dissipated into thin air. The house was sold. The legal battles were over, and Emily and Michael's attempts to regain control had been dismantled piece by piece. In a way, I expected to feel victorious, elated even, but the feeling that lingered was something different, something quieter, more subtle. It wasn't happiness. Not exactly. It was freedom. True, unburdened freedom. A sense of release. From years of self-imposed obligations and unacknowledged resentment, I could finally breathe without the weight of others' expectations suffocating me. I found myself spending the following weeks making small changes, one step at a time, reclaiming not just my physical space but my emotional space as well. There was a sense of calm that had settled into my life, one that I hadn't experienced in years. The mornings were quieter now, the air less heavy. I woke up without the looming thought of what Emily might need or what Michael might demand. The peace in my house was unlike any peace I'd known before. But as much as I relished the stillness, I knew it couldn't last forever. I couldn't simply exist in a state of passive freedom. I had spent too much time living reactively, letting others dictate the course of my life. Now, I had the chance to take control of my own destiny. I had earned that, and it was time to make something of it. The first change was small. I rearranged the furniture in my living room, moving the chairs away from the windows and opening up the space. It wasn't much, but it felt symbolic. I was making room for something new, something just for me. I pulled the heavy curtains back and let the natural light flood in, illuminating the room in a way I hadn't let it in years. It was a simple act, but it felt like a declaration I was no longer hiding in the shadows of my past. Next came the bigger changes. I had always dreamed of traveling, of seeing parts of the world that had been closed off to me because of my responsibilities. Emily and Michael had always been my priority, and that meant my dreams were deferred, always pushed to the side. But now, for the first time in a long time, I didn't have to answer to anyone. I didn't have to put my desires on hold anymore. I pulled up my laptop one evening and began researching travel destinations. I didn't have a specific place in mind. I just knew that I needed to go somewhere new, somewhere that would challenge me, somewhere that would remind me of who I was outside of the role of father and provider. The world, it seemed, was vast and open, full of opportunities and adventures that had always seemed out of reach. But now, it was all within my grasp. I finally settled on a road trip across Canada, something I had always wanted to do but had never had the time or freedom for. I was going to take a month to explore the natural beauty of my own country, driving from the mountains of British Columbia to the coastal towns of Nova Scotia. There was something thrilling about the idea of traveling alone, just me and the open road. I knew it would be an adventure, but what I didn't realize at the time was how much it would change me. The freedom to explore on my own terms, without the weight of familial obligations hanging over me, was a gift I hadn't anticipated. Each day on the road felt like a new beginning, a fresh chapter in a book that I had once thought was closed. The first day of the trip was, as expected, a bit awkward. I had spent so many years tending to others, managing the needs and wants of everyone around me, that I almost didn't know what to do with myself when it was just me. But as the miles passed beneath the tires, I began to settle into the rhythm of the journey. The landscape of the Canadian Rockies unfolded before me, vast and wild, reminding me that life wasn't always about fitting into a mold or following a script. Sometimes it was about going off course, taking risks, and embracing the unknown. I stayed in small towns, visited local landmarks, and met strangers who, like me, were just passing through. I spent evenings by lakesides, watching the sunset with a cold beer in hand, and mornings sipping coffee in little diners where the locals knew each other by name. I found comfort in the simplicity of it all. I didn't need anything extravagant. I just needed to be present, to be in the moment, to experience life as it came. By the time I reached the Maritimes, I felt like a different person. I was no longer the man burdened by others' expectations. I was Caleb, the man who could choose his own path, who could create his own future. The landscapes I had driven through had been beautiful, but the real transformation had happened inside me. I had learned to embrace uncertainty, to find joy in the small moments, and to let go of the past. One evening, as I sat on the rocky shore of the Bay of Fundy, watching the tides roll in, I thought about Emily and Michael. I thought about how much I had given to them, how much I had sacrificed, and how little they had ever truly appreciated it. I thought about the way they had tried to control me, to manipulate me into continuing to be their source of support without ever offering anything in return. But as I sat there, the waves crashing at my feet, I realized something important. They didn't have the power to define my life anymore. I had taken that power back. I had chosen to live for myself. That night, I made a promise to myself. I promised that I would never again let anyone, not even my own family, dictate my happiness. I would live my life on my terms, and I would never allow myself to be used or manipulated again. The trip came to an end, but the changes I had made to my life didn't stop there. When I returned home to Toronto, I felt renewed, like I had shed an old skin. I had learned how to live for myself, to embrace independence, and to take ownership of my future. The next few months were spent solidifying my new life. I found new hobbies, things I had always wanted to try but never had the time for. I joined a local photography club and began taking classes in digital design. I spent more time with old friends, reconnecting with people who had always been there but who I had neglected in the past. But the most important change was the way I viewed my relationships with Emily and Michael. I knew they would never truly understand what I had done, why I had cut them off, why I had made the decisions I did, but that was no longer my concern. They would have to live with their own choices, just as I was living with mine. And for the first time, I was at peace with that. One afternoon, as I sat in a cafe reading a book, my phone buzzed on the table. It was an international call, Emily. I hesitated for a moment before answering. Dad, her voice was tentative. Different from the last time we had spoken. We need to talk. I took a deep breath and set the book aside. I didn't know what she wanted or what had changed. But I knew I couldn't let her manipulate me again. I had taken control of my life, and I wasn't about to let anyone take that away. Emily, I said calmly, I'm listening. The conversation was long, and though it wasn't easy, it was necessary. We talked about the past, about the mistakes I had made, and the things I had allowed to happen. She apologized for the way things had gone between us, for taking me for granted. But it wasn't a perfect conversation. It wasn't the resolution I had once hoped for, but it was a start. By the end of the call, I knew that we had reached a new understanding. I wasn't ready to welcome her back into my life the way things had been before, but I was ready to build a new relationship, one where boundaries were respected and where I didn't feel like I had to sacrifice my own well-being for the sake of others. I hung up the phone and sat back in my chair. The weight of the conversation settled in my chest. But this time, it wasn't heavy. It was a reminder that while I couldn't change the past, I could shape the future. The chapter with Emily and Michael wasn't over, but it was different now. I had taken control of my life, and no one was going to take that away from me. I looked out the window, the streets of Toronto stretching before me, and I smiled. I had chosen this life, and for the first time in years, it felt like Minna. The days that followed the call with Emily were filled with a strange mixture of emotions, relief, exhaustion, and an underlying sense of hope I hadn't felt in years. The conversation had been necessary, but it was far from easy. Emily's apology had been sincere. Or at least, I hoped it was. But it wasn't enough to undo the damage that had been done. It wasn't enough to return things to how they had been before. But that was the point. Wasn't it? I wasn't the same person I had been. And I didn't want things to go back to the way they had been. I wanted something better. Something real. The weight that had hung over me for so long. The guilt and the obligation that I had carried for years was slowly lifting. The constant pressure to be the provider, the fixer, the ever-available father who would drop everything at a moment's notice. It was gone. For the first time in my life, I was beginning to see myself not through the lens of others' needs, but as someone who could choose his own path. It wasn't just the conversation with Emily that had sparked this change. It was everything that had led up to it. The sale of the house. The legal battles. The road trip across Canada, all of it, had been part of a larger process of rediscovery. I had spent so many years living for others, trying to prove my worth through endless sacrifice and giving, that I had lost sight of who I was. But now, the fog had cleared, and I was starting to see myself clearly again. I found myself at a crossroads, though it didn't feel like one. I had the freedom I had longed for, the independence I had fought for. But what was I going to do with it? The world outside was still moving at its usual pace, people going to work, driving through the city streets, going about their lives as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed for me. And I realized that it wasn't just about what had happened with Emily and Michael. It was about me. It was about who I had become and who I wanted to be. The first step was simple. I needed to rediscover what made me happy. For so long, my happiness had been tied to my ability to help others, to fix their problems, to make sure they had what they needed. But now, it was time to figure out what I wanted. And so, I began small. I started with my routine. Mornings were once filled with anxiety, checking emails, managing calls, worrying about what Emily needed or what Michael expected. Now, mornings were different. I woke up without that sense of urgency, without that constant pull to serve someone else's agenda. I took my time, savoring my coffee, reading the newspaper, and allowing myself to enjoy the quiet. It was a small change, but it was significant. It was the first step in reclaiming my own space. I also began to focus on my physical well-being, something I hadn't done in years. I had always been the kind of person who put others first, who sacrificed his own needs for the sake of those around him. But now, I was starting to make time for myself. I started running again, something I had loved in my youth but had abandoned over the years. The rhythmic sound of my feet hitting the pavement was oddly soothing, like a reminder that I was moving forward, one step at a time. The next big step was more personal. I had always been a private person, someone who didn't open up easily, who kept his feelings buried beneath the surface. But now, I felt like I could breathe again. I began to reach out to old friends, people I had lost touch with over the years. I rekindled old friendships, sent messages to people I hadn't spoken to in ages, and made plans to meet for coffee or lunch. It was strange at first, reconnecting with people I hadn't seen in years. But it was also liberating. I wasn't just rebuilding my life in a practical sense. I was rebuilding it socially, emotionally, and with each conversation, with each laugh shared over a cup of coffee, I realized how much I had been missing. But it wasn't just the external changes that were affecting me. It was the internal shift that was taking place. I had spent so much time living for others that I had forgotten what it was like to live for myself. The self-doubt, the guilt, the fear of disappointing others, all of it had weighed on me for so long that I had lost sight of my own needs, my own desires, But now, as I looked back on the months that had passed since the sale of the house, I saw a different picture. I had chosen my own path. I had taken control, and I wasn't going to let that go. One day, as I was sitting on the porch, enjoying the warm breeze and watching the sunset, I realized that I was no longer waiting for something to happen. I wasn't waiting for Emily to change, or for Michael to apologize, or for some grand resolution to unfold. I had already moved on. I had already created the life I wanted. It was mine, and I was the one who had built it. There was no going back. That evening, after dinner, I sat down at the kitchen table with a glass of wine, my mind drifting. I thought about the people I had helped, the sacrifices I had made, the endless hours spent trying to be everything for everyone. I thought about the people I had lost along the way, and I wondered if they would ever understand. But then I stopped myself. Did it matter? Did it matter if they understood? Did it matter if Emily and Michael ever realized what I had done for them? The answer, surprisingly, was no. It didn't matter. What mattered was that I understood. What mattered was that I had finally learned to live for myself, to make choices based on what I needed, not what others expected of me. A few weeks later, I got an email from Marcus. The property on Maple Street had officially closed, and I received my final payment. It wasn't about the money, though it wasn't about the value of the house or the sale. It was about the fact that I had made a decision, a difficult one, but one that had set me free, and with that freedom, I had gained something far more valuable than any property could offer. I started making plans for the next chapter of my life. I didn't know exactly what it would look like, but I knew it was going to be something new, something that belonged entirely to me. I had already begun working on my photography skills, and even started building a portfolio. It was a dream I had held on to for years, but it had always seemed out of reach. Now, with a newfound sense of purpose, I was diving in head first. I began to travel again, visiting small towns across Ontario and taking photos of landscapes, people, and moments that caught my eye. I joined a photography community online, sharing my work, receiving feedback, and learning more about the craft. It felt good, really good to finally do something that was mine, to have something that was entirely mine to shape and grow. As the months went on, I grew more comfortable in my own skin. The old anxieties and fears that had once controlled me began to fade into the background. I wasn't the same man I had been when I was trapped in the demands of family, when I had allowed myself to be defined by what others needed from me. I had learned to find peace in the present, in the quiet moments of my own life. I had also started writing, something I had never thought I could do. It wasn't a grand ambition. I wasn't planning to publish a book, but writing, for me, was a way to process everything I had been through, to reflect on the journey I had taken and how far I had come. It was a cathartic experience, and with each word I wrote, I felt more and more like I was truly reclaiming myself. One evening, as I was working on a new photograph in my studio, my phone buzzed. It was an email from Emily, et un simple message, but one that caught me off guard. Dad, I hope you're well. I've been thinking about everything that's happened and wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't realize how much I hurt you. I know I've made mistakes, and I hope one day we can talk more. For a moment, I sat there, the phone in my hand, staring at the words. It wasn't the apology I had once hoped for, but it was a start. I wasn't sure what it meant, or where it would lead, but I realized something important. In that moment, I didn't need closure from Emily. I didn't need her to validate my choices or my actions. I had already found that within myself, The road ahead was still unclear. There would be challenges, moments of doubt, and the occasional pull of old habits. But I knew one thing for sure. I was no longer waiting for someone else to give me permission to live my life. I had already taken that first step, and I was walking it every day. And for the first time in years, I could say with certainty that I was content. I sat on my porch that evening, the light of the setting sun casting long shadows across my yard. The world around me felt alive in a way it hadn't in years. The birds were chirping. The distant hum of cars on the street echoed like the beat of my own heart, steady and calm. It was the kind of evening that made me feel like everything had fallen into place. Even if I wasn't entirely sure what the next step would look like, I was no longer running away from anything. For the first time in a long while, I was simply here, and that was enough. The email from Emily still sat unread in my inbox, but it no longer held the same weight it once would have. The words had lost their sting, the guilt no longer gnawing at me. In the past, I would have dropped everything to respond to her, to fix whatever had gone wrong. But I had changed. I had learned that some things, some relationships, needed to heal on their own time. I had already taken the first step by letting go, and now, the rest of the healing, whether with Emily or on my own, was something I would do at my own pace. I had spent so many years living in the shadow of others, trying to meet expectations, to fulfill roles that had never truly been mine. But now, everything had shifted. I was no longer defined by my role as a father, a provider, a fixer. I was defined by who I was now. In this moment, Caleb, a man who had taken control of his own life, his own destiny. I smiled to myself as I sipped my coffee, letting the warmth of it spread through me. It was a simple thing, but I found so much comfort in those quiet moments. And that's when I realized I didn't need to have everything figured out. I didn't need to know exactly what my future held. All I needed to do was keep moving forward, one step at a time, trusting that the path would reveal itself. The next few weeks were a blur of new experiences. I continued to pour my energy into my photography, exploring new corners of the city, capturing moments that spoke to me. I joined an online community of photographers, shared my work, and received feedback that fueled my creative fire. I felt like a new person each time I picked up my camera. The world had so much beauty to offer, and I was finally seeing it, not through the lens of responsibility, but through the lens of joy and discovery. But even as I dove deeper into my photography and other newfound passions, I knew there were still things to resolve. The relationship with Emily, though it had taken a back seat, was still in need of healing. I didn't know what that would look like, but I wasn't afraid to face it. I had learned that true peace didn't come from avoiding conflict or pretending everything was fine. True peace came from knowing I had the strength to confront difficult conversations and navigate them on my terms. And so, when the call came, I wasn't surprised. It was Emily again. For a moment, I hesitated. I wasn't sure if I was ready for another conversation with her, one that might reopen old wounds. But I had come so far, and I knew that avoiding her calls would only prolong the inevitable. So, I picked up the phone. "Dad." Her voice was soft, tentative, almost like a child trying to test the waters. I could tell she wasn't sure how to approach me, how to repair the distance between us. "Emily," I said, my voice steady but not unkind. "We can talk. What's on your mind?" There was a long pause on the other end, and for a brief moment, I thought she might hang up. But then, she spoke again, to her voice softer, more vulnerable than it had been during our last conversation. "I just wanted to say that I'm sorry. I know I hurt you, and I don't want to keep making things worse. I closed my eyes and listened. I hadn't expected an apology. Not really. Not one that felt genuine. Not one that would make a difference. But this was different. This was the beginning of something, a shift, a chance to rebuild what had been broken. And it was exactly what I needed to hear. I appreciate that. Emily, I said slowly, but I need you to understand something. I did what I had to do. I had to take control of my life. I had to stop being the one who always gave in, who always let you take. It wasn't easy, but it was necessary, and I hope you can respect that. There was a silence on the other end, but it wasn't the kind of silence I had expected. It wasn't uncomfortable or filled with tension. It was thoughtful, reflective. After a moment, Emily spoke again. I do respect that. Dad, I think I've been so caught up in what I wanted, in what I thought was mine, that I didn't realize what I was doing to you. And I'm sorry for that. I really am. It was the first time I had heard her take full responsibility for her actions. The first time I had heard her acknowledge the weight of what she had put me through. It wasn't a perfect apology, and I wasn't expecting perfection. But it was progress, and that was all I could ask for. I'm not asking for anything from you. Emily, I said, my voice gentle. I'm not looking for your approval or your forgiveness. I'm just asking that you understand what I needed to do, and that you respect my decision. I've spent too long living for others. It's time for me to live for myself. There was a pause before she spoke again, quieter this time. I get that. Dad, I really do. And I'm not going to try to change things. I just want to make sure we're okay. I don't want to lose you. I let out a breath, feeling the tension leave my body. This wasn't the end of our relationship, but it was a new beginning. It wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to happen overnight, but it was a start, a new chapter for both of us. We'll be okay. Emily, I said, my voice full of certainty. We'll figure it out, but it has to be on my terms, just like it always should have been. After a few more words of understanding, we ended the call, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel weighed down by what had been said. I didn't feel burdened by guilt or regret. I felt free. The days after the call felt different, lighter, like a new chapter was unfolding. Not just in my relationship with Emily, but in my life as a whole. I spent more time on my photography, exploring new angles and experimenting with different styles. I began looking into taking a photography course, something I had always wanted to do but had never had the time for. There was a sense of excitement building within me, a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. I also made more time for myself. I began reading books I had put off, walking through the parks near my home, and finding joy in the small things I had taken for granted in the past. I was no longer the man who measured his worth by how much he could give. I was Caleb, the man who was learning to live for himself. One afternoon, as I sat on my porch with a book in hand, I realized something important. It wasn't about making amends with Emily or Michael. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about finding peace within myself. I had spent so much of my life trying to meet the expectations of others, trying to fix things that weren't mine to fix. But now, I was learning how to be okay with where I was, who I was, and what I had accomplished. The world outside my window continued on as it always had. But I had changed. I was no longer waiting for someone else to tell me who I was or what I should do. I was living my life on my terms. And for the first time in years, I felt at peace. I had finally found what I had been searching for all along: freedom. The days that followed the call with Emily were filled with a sense of quiet reflection, a deep stillness that settled into the corners of my life. There was no fanfare, no dramatic revelation or sudden transformation. The change had been slow, gradual, almost imperceptible, but it was real, and I could feel it in every part of me, the way I woke up in the morning, the way I moved through my day, and the way I no longer felt the weight of past mistakes or unspoken expectations dragging me down. The healing wasn't just about fixing what had been broken between Emily and me. It was about reclaiming the parts of me I had lost over the years, parts that had been buried under the constant pressure of providing for others, of living up to expectations, of always being there, without ever truly being seen. I had spent decades running on fumes, giving without thinking about what I needed or wanted, only to find myself empty and worn out. But now, that emptiness was slowly being filled with something new, something that felt like peace, like balance. I spent my mornings the same way I had since returning from my road trip across Canada, sipping my coffee, listening to the birds outside, and watching the world wake up. I had become more attuned to the present, more appreciative of the small, everyday moments that made life meaningful. There were no grand plans or big dreams, just a steady, quiet contentment that filled my days. I had also continued my photography, pushing myself to explore new styles and techniques. I spent weekends wandering through the city, taking photos of everything from the smallest details of nature to the bustling life of Toronto's streets. Each click of the camera felt like a new opportunity to see the world through fresh eyes, to find beauty in the most unexpected places. It wasn't about winning awards or impressing anyone. It was about capturing moments, preserving them for myself, and finding joy in the process. But even as I continued to build this new life, I knew that my relationship with Emily wasn't over. We had made progress, but there was still work to be done. I wasn't sure what the future held for us, but I had stopped waiting for it to unfold in a specific way. I had stopped trying to control the outcome, and in that surrender, I found freedom. It was one late afternoon, as I was sitting on my porch with a glass of wine, that I received another email from Emily. This time, it wasn't an apology or a plea for reconciliation. It was something different, something that caught me off guard. The email was short, but the words had a weight to them. Dad, I've been thinking about everything you said, and I've realized that I've been selfish, thinking only about myself. I've spent so much time focused on what I want that I never stopped to consider what you needed. I'm sorry for that. I want to try again. But this time, I want to do it the right way. I want to work on being a daughter you can be proud of, not just someone who takes from you. I read the email twice, feeling a strange mixture of emotions, surprise, relief, and even a little apprehension. It wasn't a perfect message, and it didn't fix everything, but it was progress. For the first time in our relationship, Emily was acknowledging the truth of what had happened and taking responsibility for it. And that meant more to me than anything else. I didn't immediately reply. I didn't need to. I had already made my decision in my heart. I had let go of the need to fix things on my terms. I had let go of the idea that my role as a father was to constantly bend, constantly give, and constantly sacrifice. I had given enough of myself over the years. Now, it was time to rebuild not just my relationship with Emily, but my relationship with myself. Over the next few days, I thought a lot about what the future held. What did it mean to truly forgive? To rebuild a relationship on healthier terms? And more importantly, what did it mean to let go of the past completely? to stop letting old wounds define the way I moved forward. It wasn't about forgetting what had happened. It was about accepting it, learning from it, and choosing not to let it hold me hostage any longer. One evening, I sat down at my kitchen table, opened my laptop, and began drafting a response to Emily's email. I took my time with it, carefully choosing my words. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't resentful. I was simply ready. Emily, I wrote, I'm proud of you for acknowledging what happened. It takes a lot of courage to look back and see the ways we've hurt others, even when we don't want to. I'm not sure what the future holds for us, but I know that we're both in a better place now. I'm not asking for anything more than the truth, and I'm not asking you to fix everything. I'm simply asking that we move forward with respect for ourselves and for each other. We don't need to go back to what we were, but maybe we can build something new, something better. I sent the email, and as I did, I felt a sense of relief. Not because everything had been fixed, not because the past had been erased, but because I had taken another step toward healing, toward embracing the present without carrying the weight of what had been. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was one that felt right. The following months passed in a blur of small moments and quiet joys. Emily and I didn't see each other every day, or even every week, but there was a sense of understanding between us now that hadn't existed before. She respected my boundaries. I respected hers, and in that mutual respect, we found the space to rebuild our relationship not as it had been, but as it could be, and as I continued to live my life, exploring my passions, investing in myself, and learning to let go of the past. I realized something important. The future wasn't something I could control. It wasn't something anyone could control. But what I could control was how I moved through it, how I chose to respond to the challenges that came my way, and how I chose to show up for the people I loved. One evening, as I was finishing up a photography project, I received a text from Emily. She wanted to meet for coffee. It had been a while since we'd seen each other in person, and though I wasn't sure what to expect, I agreed. When we met, it wasn't dramatic. There were no grand apologies, no emotional outbursts. It was just a simple conversation between two people who had learned a lot over the past year about themselves, about each other, and about what it meant to move forward. We talked about our lives, about the things we had learned, and about the future. It was normal. It was healthy. And that, more than anything, was enough. As I drove home that evening, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I had come. A year ago, I had been stuck in a cycle of emotional exhaustion, giving and giving without ever receiving. I had let my role as a father define me, let it shape every decision I made. But now, I was free. I had learned that I was not defined by what others needed from me. I was defined by what I chose to do with my life, by the way I chose to live in the present. And that, I realized, was the greatest lesson of all: the power of letting go of old patterns, old expectations, and old relationships that no longer served me. Letting go of the need for validation, for approval, for acceptance. Letting go of the past and embracing the future, one moment at a time. As I pulled into my driveway and walked into my house, I knew that this was just the beginning. The future was still unknown, still full of possibilities, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I had taken control of my life. And with that, I was finally free. If you like this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share your impressions of this story in the comments. To listen to the next story, click on the box on the left. Thank you for watching.